I'm sure that we will have some stragglers, but we have a lot to talk about today and a lot that we want to cover. So I'm David Burson. I'm the chair of Ameinu Canada. And before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples across Canada, caretakers and stewards of this land for time immemorial, each with its own traditions, languages, and history. I'm currently speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And if you'd like to share the Indigenous territories from which you're joining, you are welcome to do so in the chat. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our members for your support and for your patience as we get ourselves into a better organizational position. We have a lot of balls in the air, and most of us are doing multiple things. Your membership matters, and we want your input. We have plans for the coming year to deepen our connections with you and expand our connections with progressive forces in Canada, Israel, and Palestine, with a focus on advancing the third narrative as an educational leadership tool. You'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. I also want to recognize our founding board members, Trilby Smith, Ruthie Wicks, Idan Suleimani, and Bernard Bochbod. And I'd also like to welcome our new partner, my new partner, Maytal Kowalski, who is our educational coordinator, and Gal Isaac, who's currently on Gabriola Island. She is the Shlicha for Habonim Dror in our region. They're beginning camp in a few weeks and are extremely busy. And I'd also like to recognize our partnership with ARTSA Canada, which is the Reform Zionist movement, and recognize my friend Lee Weiser, who serves as president. As you heard, we'll be recording this leadership educational session for security and educational purposes. We'll have about an hour to an hour and a half today in order to have time for both moderated questions and answers and questions from you. I'm going to introduce Maytal now, and Maytal will introduce our guests and will serve as our moderator. Maytal is our volunteer program coordinator and curator for what we're calling AS, the Ameinu Activist Series, contributing to widening and deepening our knowledge and understanding of not only what is going on, but what we can do in terms of what's going on the ground in Israel and Palestine. In addition to her work with Ameinu Canada, Maytal also sits on the board of New Israel Fund of Canada and J-Space Canada, and is is an Israel Policy Forum ATID 2021 convener. She grew up in Israel, originally from Canada. She lived in Israel on kibbutz, moshav, and a mixed city. And she has been surrounded by and is passionate about social justice causes as they pertain to both Israeli civil society and diaspora Jewry. And I hope that we will also mention at the end, Maytal, the program that you're involved with in Vancouver, an in-person program, which is coming under the auspices of the New Israel Fund Canada at my synagogue, which is dealing with the Tag Meir, the head of Tag Meir, who's going to be here as a guest. So that's very exciting. Anyways, I'd like to turn it over to you, Maytal, and thank you to everyone who's here this morning for what promises to be an inciting and insightful, inciting, and maybe uncomfortable conversation, but one that we really welcome with an open heart. So thank you, Maytal, and thank you to Tali and Alon-Lee.
Hi, thanks, David, for that intro. Yes, I feel so fortunate to continue to be able to curate this series for Ameinu Canada. Some of you have joined us before. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the third in our series, and we can see as well that folks are, I think, getting outside a little bit as the weather gets warmer. So we've got a small but mighty group today, which is going to be also really nice for conversation. We hope it's really lively and we can get really intimate and personal with our conversation. So for today, I know I can speak for both David and myself when I say that, like, not only are we so excited to welcome Sally Abed and Alon-Lee Green from Standing Together, we're a little bit starstruck, and this is very, very exciting for us. We're so happy to have them here. for folks that aren't familiar with Standing Together and with Sally and Alon-Lee specifically, Alon-Lee Green is the founding national director of Standing Together, and began his activist work organizing Israel's first trade union of waiters in a chain of coffee shops as a teenager. Alon-Lee also worked as a political and parliamentary advisor in the Knesset, and is responsible for advancing the rights of workers, students, and the LGBTQ+ community in Israel. Sally Abed is a Palestinian citizen of Israel and a member of the national leadership of Standing Together, as well as the resource development and relations coordinator. As we start to speak, if Sally's voice sounds familiar to you, it may be because you listen to the Promise podcast or to Groundwork. And if you don't, you should, and we'll put some links in the chat for you to check those out. As David mentioned, we will do a Q&A at the end. We hope to have about 15 to 20 minutes for the Q&A. You are encouraged to ask questions in your own voice. You can use the raise hand function that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can actually just physically raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you aren't comfortable speaking up, or if you prefer to type out your question, you can do it in the chat and we'll add it to the queue, but we will go in order and we do want to try to get to everybody. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our two guests. We've got Alon-Lee Green and we've got Sally Abed, who I'm just going to add to our screen here right now. Hi, Alon-Lee and Sally. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, good evening or good morning. Thank you.
So I give a really brief introduction of you two, but I'd like to pass it over to you to give us some introductions. Tell us a bit about yourself, how you got involved with Standing Together, and for those that don't know, like, what's your elevator pitch as to what Standing Together is all about?
All right, I'll start. You're doing this. You're down for me. I don't know. Yeah, I'm Sally Abed. I am a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and I'm a proud member of the national leadership at Standing Together. We are a democratic movement, and we have an elected national leadership, which Alon-Lee and I are both part of. And tell you a little bit about myself. I have a very long story of how I got to Standing Together, but I think I will make it very short to just the fact that, Standing Together is the largest Jewish Arab grassroots movement in Israel. And we are organizing people, which means we are building power methodologically by growing our base and growing our support, and also mobilizing people around issues of peace, equality, and social justice, under the very deep understanding that without actually building the political capital, the political will within Israel to pursue peace and to end the occupation, and without building the political capital to understand that we have a majority in Israel that actually has the interest in equality and social justice, we won't actually be able to do changes and actually create the change that we want to see. So Standing Together is trying to envision and trying to actually build this new majority of people in Israel through creating a movement, a people's movement in Israel. And I say that because I grew up in a small town, a Palestinian town in the Western Galilee called Ma'alia. And I grew up really, like most Palestinians in Israel, not really thinking that, one, I have the right to be Palestinian in Israel, in my homeland, or two, I had the right to be an equal citizen of Israel and have the take and have the part in actually advancing things that are relevant to my life here, beyond, including and beyond being a Palestinian in Israel. I think there is a huge divide between what we actually want to see in Israel as the very obvious fact that the majority of the people actually want peace and want an end to the occupation, and people want to live in an equal and just society. And between how do we envision that we, how do we envision who is us, right? Who is the us or the we that actually wants that? Because this divide comes from a very problematic political conversation, a very problematic binary system, and very problematic divide historically and narrative-wise. We organize and mobilize people around these issues, around local campaigns through local chapters, 8 local chapters, as well as in universities. We are the largest organized student group in student unions in Israel, and we actually are advancing issues that are relevant to people's lives. David actually asked me, actually, I'll get that later. I think David wants to ask it, so I could give it more context. So I'll give it to Alon-Lee now.
So hi, my name is Alon-Lee Green, and usually at this part I will tell you about myself, but as Sally really cut to the point, I will also try to tell you that we're talking to you today after a very dramatic week we had. Around us, the government is, having its last days. The coalition will probably not last more than a week, maybe a month from today. The political struggle between the Israeli left and the Israeli right wing is at its peak. Everyone is fighting with everyone. But we, as a political, social Jewish Arab movement, passed just last Wednesday a bill at the preliminary vote at the Knesset to raise the minimum wage in Israel from 29 shekels an hour to 40 shekels an hour. One of our movement's biggest successes so far. And the reason I'm presenting it like this is that it's tough for us. We are in a very, very challenging moment of the Israeli society. Racism is everywhere. Even the coalition, which is supposed to be more leaning to the left, as it has the left-wing parties in it, is blaming the Arabs for breaking the coalition, and the right wing is blaming the Arabs, and the occupation is really being wild in the West Bank. Houses and families are being demolished, and families are being evacuated, Palestinian families. In the Negev, the south of Israel, the situation is very tense and fragile and violent. Economically, people are suffering and struggling in Israel. The rents are rising and rising, and salaries are staying the same. Public transportation, food costs, everything is becoming more and more expensive. And we feel that it's such, I would say it's such a it's not obvious that we're talking about life itself. Everyone around us is fighting between left wing and right wing, and we're insisting talking about our lives, our struggles, our daily needs, and the fact that we managed to create from a Jewish Arab movement a struggle that has scored such a big win in parliament is, I think, a testimony of how people are really thirsty for this kind of politics that is putting, those old ways of dividing our society, in the past, and is trying to create a new kind of majority in the Israeli society, saying that people from the Haredi community and Palestinians in Israel and people from the periphery and people from the center and men and women and Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, we can all benefit from moving forward as a society and achieving social justice and security and peace. And, when we built the movement, we didn't know we're going to become a movement. It started as an initiative. Time was bad, just 5 years ago, we had another violent escalation, and we decided as a group of activists that we need to respond, that we need to have a voice out there of Jews and Arabs saying that there is another way, that racism and occupation and incitement, that's not the only reality possible. And we insisted on pointing on this other way. But then we understood it's not enough to move from one demonstration to the other. It's not enough to just, have our voice being put out there. We need to organize. We need to build power around our message. We need to build power around our will to change society, because the forces we're dealing with are so strong that without organizing and mobilizing masses in the Israeli society, we will not be able to achieve anything. And within almost 6 years, we've been able to build this struggle for raising the minimum wage and build struggles in the West Bank and in Israel to stop the occupation and achieving peace. And I think we can, get in the questions or a bit deeper on how we do things. But I think the message Sally and I are coming to you tonight with is that it's a dramatic moment in the Israeli society, but we feel proud of what we achieved and the power that we're starting to build here.
I just want to add another thing, especially to people abroad. I think a lot of the times, I always say that we are overlooked, but I think I found a different way to say it. I think just like I think a lot of people have given up on the Israeli public. I think a lot of people has lost hope of building a new kind of hope, a new kind of vision, a new kind of politics in Israel. And I think that by building a movement that does not give up on the Israeli public, not because we don't want to, and not because it's easy, it's the hardest thing to do, but also because under the very deep understanding that unless we are building a movement that can create the political will for change in Israel, it won't happen. And I think that's the main message that we are bringing as a movement and as Israeli citizens and as a Palestinian and a Jew.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So, I want to kind of jump off on that because you're talking about, building a new kind of majority, being at a point, we were talking a little bit before, when we were all on the Zoom call just about just feeling like society is kind of at a breaking point. And so I want to take us back for a second. It's June 2022. It's really hard for me to believe that it was over a year ago that we saw first of all, we saw the war with Gaza, but we also saw violence in the mixed cities, right? And I think for a lot of us, especially in the diaspora, there's a facade, or we can allow there to be a facade of like, but look at these beautiful mixed cities, right? We talk about Haifa, we talk about Lod, and this dream of coexistence, and we saw something happen that, to Alon-Lee's earlier point of like, kind of just this racism being everywhere and things kind of being at a boiling point. So I want to ask, if we can go back to what happened a year and a bit ago, and specifically within those mixed cities, and what effect that had on you, what effect that had on the movement, and what do you see coming out of that, both positive and negative?
The May events of 2021 were extremely hard on the Israeli society as a whole and on the movement in particular. When you have such, events that are very polarizing, I can't overemphasize how polarizing you feel, even as an activist who truly believes in shared society and truly believes in the necessity of Jewish-Arab partnership. It's the hardest possible place to be in, to be in the middle and actually be able to talk about the partnership during these times. It was really a crisis that we felt even within the movement. Our streets were on fire, literally on fire. And you could smell the hatred. You could smell the fear. You could smell, for me as a Palestinian, I lived in Jaffa, and Jaffa was one of the hot points, the hot spots of violence. And, the police was the main aggressor for me. And I really did not feel safe anywhere. I also did not feel like I was allowed to hurt as a Palestinian. That was not legitimate. And I was also not allowed to hurt as an Israeli, even though I was going through exactly the same trauma as the Israeli public, and the same exactly violence, and the exact same, reality of overnights, and all-nighters in the shelter, and bombs and everything. And it was a point where we really had to have very difficult conversations in the movement and understand, how do we build a space that can be safe, but also actually critical. And I think if you asked us 5 years ago, would there be an anti-occupation protests or peace protests during war, literally when there were sirens, people would tell you, no way. And even if you asked a year before May events, people would have been extremely skeptical. And I think what Standing Together was able to do is really show that there is this new kind of political current. There is a new space, there is a new political home that can resist the urge to resolve, this polarization, and resolve these issues that honestly we don't actually understand ourselves how to resolve them, these complexities, but also insist on navigating through them and overcoming them during these times. And that's what Standing Together did, through rigorous organizing and through rigorous, we actually built a base through in 6 years, 5 years back then, that were able to contain that kind of complexity. And Standing Together was the main mobilizer of hundreds of spots of protests around the country, with tens of thousands of people who went out to protest, Palestinians and Jews in Israel, to protest the war, to protest the violence, and to also refuse the status quo and refuse the occupation as the source of these cycles of violence. How it affected us, I think, it affected us a lot. It really is very draining, very challenging. As I said, it was really a crisis. But I think that looking back, we are very grateful to the movement that we built. And we are very grateful to the people around us, and that we were able to overcome it and actually come out stronger. And that's the beautiful thing in building a movement and organizing, is that we were able to actually absorb a lot of the momentum into the movement, and actually being able to utilize that towards other issues like the minimum wage, and actually mobilizing more and more people against the occupation and for peace in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So overall, I would say that we are not naive. It was extremely difficult, and I think it's becoming even more and more complex, the situation. With that being said, we do feel like we are growing stronger, and we are very optimistic.
Alon-Lee, do you have anything you want to add?
I may just add that I know that sometimes looking from afar on Israel and Palestine, and on the ongoing eruptions of violence and escalation, you could be drawn so easily to the question of who's the good guys and who's the bad guys, and to pick sides and look at the extreme leaders in our society and say that's the example and that's who they are. And I think what we're trying to portray and to really insist on saying to our partners abroad is that it is so important for us that you will look at Israel and Palestine and see people, and also see that we, as the people that are living here, are not our government, and we are not the settlements, and we are not, the politicians in our country, and we have our needs and hopes and fears and interests, and we are in a conflict with the ones that are leading us, because they are not leading us to security, and they are not leading us for peace, and they are not leading us into a better future. And we got, honestly, very saddened to see a lot of our partners in the US, in the UK, in politics in the world, ignoring the question of whether there is an Israeli society of Palestinians and Jews that is losing also from this reality. Sometimes they even told us that we are benefiting something from the occupation or from another war, which is absurd. But that's, that's at least, or the minimum is that they just ignore us. And it's important for us to disconnect this connection between our government and the people, as much as it's important probably for the Palestinians to say also, in the West Bank, that they are not their leaders and that they have their own aspirations and need and fears and hopes. And it is, sometimes I will try and say it gently, sometimes this is where the extreme right wing meets some points of the left wing, where you just smash everything together and say that let's just boycott everyone, or let's just decide, they're all the same. But no, we're not the same. We have a fight in the Israeli society. We need to win this fight. You cannot expect that, the occupation will end, or we will achieve equality in this land without us as the agents of change organizing to build the power to do so. So if you want to support something, if you want to say that you take the side of the people on the ground organizing and trying to change their own realities. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much. So I want to pick up on that, actually, the Israeli society, that there is an Israeli society that exists, and it's not just represented by it in fact is not very well represented by the leadership. And, we're talking about kind of what that momentum of last year did and how that's kind of been absorbed and how that pushes you further. We talked about the minimum 40 campaign. And, I'm curious, because in the diaspora, we do usually only hear about the explosive events, right? We heard about May last year. We heard about the violence in the mixed cities. We heard about the war. I think maybe to a lot of folks, it feels like, and then it died down, but it didn't. And there's a lot still going on. So I wanted to ask you, can you talk about some of your other projects that we may not hear about in the diaspora? There's a minimum 40, and why that work in terms of advancing the needs of Israeli civil society and doing it through a Jewish-Arab partnership. Why is that equally important?
I would really want to tell you just in a second about the variety of projects we have, but I think a very important reason that it's something we need to talk about and to share is that look at the world. We're sharing so many problems. We're sharing so many kinds of politics that we need to deal with. 10 years ago, Netanyahu was the prototype of the very same extreme populist right wing that a lot of different countries in the world are dealing with right now. The question of how do we tackle racism? How do we tackle xenophobia? How do we tackle right-wing populism that is trying to build this equation of, the people against the others? It's a relevant question to a lot of us. And I think that it is very important for us to be feeling that we are in this kind of partnership with progressive movements around the world that are trying to come up together with the solutions, with the answers, with the kind of struggles that are strong enough to deal with this very tough wave of politics that is going on the world. And there are setbacks and there are like some wins, but in general, it's been a tough decade for all of us. And we need to find those answers together. And we come to the US, for example, not only to tell our story, but to learn. We come to share the examples and to learn from the stories and the struggles. And that's why we understood, for example, in Israel, that our strategy, or part of our, the main part of our strategy is to build nationwide campaigns that are dividing society, differently. Not putting, Jews against Arabs and saying, that's the main division of our politics, but it's actually building a majority around common interests or goals like housing and raising the minimum wage and public transportation. And even on the question of peace and the occupation, we try to talk about it not only as an act of solidarity with the people that are living under occupation in Gaza and West Bank, but also as an act of patriotism of us, Israeli, Jewish, and Palestinian Israelis, that are fighting for our interests to live in security and peace and equality. So we try to build our spectrum of struggles as ones that are bringing people together, a lot of people together, that is building a majority of those people, but is also looking on who's benefiting from reality as it is today. And there's always a small group in our society that is benefiting from the occupation, it's benefiting from selling weapons, is benefiting from exploiting workers and paying them the low salaries that we have in Israel, is benefiting from the high the costs that are rising and are so high in Israel. And as Sally said before, the very basic question in politics is who are the us and who are the them. And we try to build an us that is very wide and inclusive, and that's our story in politics.
So our campaigns, for example, last year we had during the pandemic 2 years ago. Wow, it was we actually have we mobilized thousands of people around the issues of unemployment and economic security and income security. This year, 10 months ago, actually, we started the campaign to raise the minimum wage. And it was really, it's funny to me to say that, to say it now, because I'm used to talk about it like something that's like about to happen, and now it happened and we won, and it's crazy. It's an amazing story. I honestly cannot undersell, like in any way, it's just, I can't oversell, sorry, like how amazing this story is of the minimum wage. We were able as a movement to not only, create the public pressure to actually pass the law, but we were actually also able to create such unlikely alliances, such a different story of politics in Israel that really tells the story of the new majority. And the fact that we were able to have people, we don't have lobbyists. We're not professional, lobbyer. We're a movement. We're a people's movement, and we actually had people who earn minimum wage that went to the Knesset and actually lobbied for themselves. And those people were, Palestinian, and they were Haredi, and they were, young people, students, and they were people from all around in such unlikely alliance. And that these are the faces that we put in. That's the story that won. And I think, at the moment, actually, this week on Friday, we are gathering as a movement, all of the members of the movement, after a process of 6 months of actually trying to understand, we had an internal conversation and filtering process to understand what's the next social campaign that we're going to have for next year. And on Friday, we're going to vote on it. So it's very, very, very exciting we're going to announce it. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, you're going to know what the new campaign is going to be. But it's exactly that. We are at a point where we are not only reacting to our reality, we're actually building political conversations. And that's national. Obviously, local, we also have many, many campaigns around local issues. We have workers' rights and, gender equality issues, safeguarding and harassment. We have issues around accessibility. We have issues around, obviously, Arab-Jewish partnership and peace. And all of these things are happening all the time, every day, through our local chapters. And obviously our national campaigns are run nationally by the leadership, but are also run by the local chapters and their leadership. So it really is a lot. It's really a multi, we have a very holistic view of the struggle that we're leading. But at the same time, it's very diverse, but it's also very wholesome in a sense that we really have managed to maintain a very certain, very clear voice, a new political voice in Israel, even though it's a lot of different things happening.
Thanks so much. So I wanted to ask, so you talked about traveling to the US. So in addition to passing the first reading of the minimum 40 bill, another thing that you recently both did was you had a tour of the US. Congratulations both on that travel and the folks that you met with, and also just being at a place where we can travel again, and you got to do that. So you definitely had some really interesting meetings for folks that follow along on social media. And if you don't, you should. It's really great to see some of those people you were meeting with, some of the conversations you were having. And so I'm really curious to know, coming out of that, and because you're speaking to a largely diasporic audience right now, what were some of the biggest misconceptions that people had about your respective communities? So either Jewish Israeli, Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza. What were some misconceptions that you heard? And then what would you suggest to us in order to be better allies here in the diaspora? What would you suggest to us to be able to kind of overcome those misconceptions and be more in allyship and in allegiance with you and the work you are doing on the ground?
That's a good question. I think we mentioned some of it. Do you want to go, or? Yeah, we mentioned some of it. I think one is the fact that the Israeli public is in conflict with its government. And I think that's something that is usually not, at least not considered as something that, and I think that's exactly the fact that gives us hope from the Israeli public. And that's the other issue, that I think a lot of people just have, it's so bad. And we're not naive. We don't think that, we're just about to, like everyone, the majority of the people are with us. We don't think that. We just firmly believe that we actually serve the interests of these people, and we actually will probably manage to mobilize them at some point. It's that misconception of that's it, we give up, it's hopeless. It's hopeless, people. Ben Gvir is pulling 6 seats in the Knesset. What does that say about the Israeli public? Bibi Netanyahu is pulling, how many seats? 30 plus seats, consistently, regardless all of the crisis, everything that happened. What does that say about the Israeli public, right? And we only understand that, if we don't actually insist on organizing Israelis around a new kind of politics, we won't see a change. So I think that's another thing, because a lot of the people, another large misconception for me, it's not even a misconception, I think it's just, I think it's the Palestinian solidarity movement, which is increasingly being affiliated with the progressive movement in the US, for example, and it's a good development, but it also has been excluded. It also has given up on organizing, not just Israeli public. They have given up, they don't even see the people that live here under occupation or the Israeli public. They don't see it. It's not part of the conversation. They don't see the people on the ground trying to actually navigate the complexities and actually build something that can lead to change. So these are the things that we really felt like needed. Need to be part of the conversation. The people who live here, basically. I think that's the common theme. Alon-Lee, do you have anything to add?
Okay, that's a great answer. Thank you. Thank you so much. We've got about 20 minutes left. So I want to see if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask. You can type it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question. And if you're still thinking about your questions, I think David is chomping at the bit to ask a question. So David, how about you ask your question?
First of all, I've been rubbing my heart a lot listening to the two of you. I wish I could give you and everyone else that are in the movement right now a big hug, because this demands such deep conviction and belief. And I totally agree with you, Alon-Lee, that this is what we're seeing reflected in so many places around the world. And I think that one of the big questions is, like, how viable is democracy as a system today in terms of being able to work? But I'm not going to get sidetracked by those questions, because I could spend hours talking about them. I'm going to ask a practical, a cynical, and a curious question. The cynical question is this just not another ploy for power? I mean, we look at what happened in 2011 and what happened with Stav and with, I'm sorry, his name slips my mind right now, and how, they got into politics as a result of the protest movements that took place, that were genuine and were grassroots and really came out of a need. Is this not just another political ploy? So that's my cynical question. The practical question is, 2 weeks ago around Nakba, we saw responses of the Israeli universities. My day job, I work for Ben Gurion University. I just finished spending the last 3 days with the president of the university. I'm very conscious of the changes on the ground, but Sally, you also indicated that you have strong membership on the campuses. I'm curious to know where the students and the response to the movement is. And then my third question, which is a curious question, is why purple? Okay, so that's just for you to chew on.
Varying degrees of difficulty with those questions.
Alon-Lee, you mentioned.
I would
stats.
actually like to start with the question you didn't ask about democracy. And I think I will want to say this sentence, that when you work in a factory very hard, and you go to work every day for a full month, and at the end of the month you feel that you cannot provide for your family, what is democracy for you? And I think that's the question we need to ask about democracy. For decades, democracy is something that is above our head, and it's hard to grasp. And we live in a democratic societies, but we are poor. Our voice is taken away from us. Our works are being taken away from us. The world is progressing sometimes without us. So it's an important question to ask: what is democracy for us? In 2011, we had a social protest. There was a very big protest in the Israeli society, part of a bigger wave of protests around the world, around questions of prices, around questions of dictatorships. It started with the Arab Spring. It moved on to the European indignados in Spain, Occupy Wall Street. In Israel, we had our own version, which was by far the largest of them all. Not in like in terms of proportions. We had it one night in the Israeli social protest, 500,000 people out in the streets, out of 8 million people. Try to compare it to American proportion, it will mean more than 20 million Americans all out at the same night in one demonstration, something unimaginable for our society. And yes, some of the leaders of this protest went on to enter politics and to enter politics in a specific political party that is part of the establishment of the Israeli political system. The core of the establishment of the Israeli political system. Did it give them the ability to create change or to bring upon the promises of the social protest for change? No. It was just the same old DNA of Labour Party, which is a very rotten party in our political system. Are we the same? No. We are building slowly political power, building a new current in Israeli politics. We've looked from the outside on more than 5 different political elections and chose to stay outside, not because we are not political or that we don't have, our beliefs on the Israeli political system, but we believe that the change that we want to see will not come one day because of someone in the parliament waking up and deciding today is the day I want to end the occupation, or today is the day I want to, give equality for the Palestinian citizens or women in Israel. Those changes will come only because of political will in the Israeli society and because of power. And we need to build this power. And being a faction of even 15 seats in the Israeli parliament, which is something, we will not, the left will not be there in the next few years, is not enough for us. If standing together will be tomorrow morning a faction of 4, 5, 6 parliament members, medium size, we will not pass the minimum 40 bill. But from working outside of parliament, bringing Haredi voters of the Haredi parties, bringing Likud voters together, bringing people from different kinds of political parties on the spectrum and building the political will to pass minimum 40. And it would be much harder to do it around questions of racism and occupation. But with doing that, we are much stronger than any political party. And even I will risk and say, even stronger than one summer of a complete burst of political energy like the summer of 2011, because that summer was amazing, but it ended in a second. And as being part of the leadership of it, I know how tough it was to sustain this energy. And it was, so easy to say, wow, I went out of my home. I demonstrated with hundreds of thousands of people. But now what? The tough question, the tough answer is building a movement.
I'll answer the third one and the fourth one. I think the situation on the ground. You mentioned Ben Gurion University, and if some people here who don't know, there was a protest. Well, actually, it wasn't even a protest. It was a standing to a remembrance of Nakba Day of Palestinian and Jewish students, actually. So many of our Jewish student members were there, and they raised Palestinian flags on campus. And it did not happen only in Ben Gurion, it also happened in Tel Aviv, and it happened in other campuses, smaller campuses as well. And actually, some Palestinian students were arrested by undercover police on campus. I'm just going to let that sit for a minute, because honestly, I feel like we're so normalized and desensitized to like political arrests, but a student on campus was arrested for raising a flag, which is not legal, and they're trying to make it illegal. So it's really the political atmosphere that we're having at the moment, and the hostility towards the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian symbols in Israel, it's a reaction. It's also a development of a more extreme and more vocal, right-wing radicals and organized radical movements on campuses and outside of campuses. But it's also a response to also a strong revival of Palestinian nationalism within young Arab Palestinians in Israel. We saw that in May last year. We really saw it was unquestionable. For many, many years, it was almost easy to ignore the fact that Arab Israelis are part of the Palestinian people, right? Even at least in the partnership, in the Arab-Jewish partnership, you didn't talk political. It was about civic equality, and it wasn't about and the systematic discrimination against Arabs in that conversation had nothing to do with the occupation, right? And I think we are starting to see a new kind of conversation and a new kind of movement from within my generation as Palestinians who are, insisting on our narrative, but are also insisting on our part of Israeli society. And to your question, David, what we're doing about it, I think, we are at a junction. There are many voices. It's a minority, but they are growing, and we saw them. They were quite loud last year that refused Arab-Jewish partnership, right? The anti-normalization Palestinian nationalism that had nothing to do. They boycott the Knesset, they boycott voting. They build their own alternative systems, and they actually refuse. Like many others, they gave up on Israeli public as a partner. And our role at Standing Together, as I see it, is building the very extremely crucial space to contain Palestinian narrative through the people's left and through the people's politic that we're trying to do. And I think that's the main task that needs to be done. I don't have answers of how we're going to do it. I do have answers of exactly how, but I do think that if, standing together is probably the closest thing to at least have some kind of idea of the next steps needed to get us closer there to building that kind of space. I don't know if that's not good enough for you, but it's the best thing that I can think of, and it gives me great hope through an impossible reality. It's extremely difficult here, and it's getting more and more hostile. But we're also are able to build these spaces, and we see them, and we see students who come to them, and we see students who seek our movement, and it gives us hope.
There's one question.
Why purple?
Yes, why purple?
Because it's a beautiful color. No, I don't know. Actually, I think it was very technical back then. Alon-Lee can talk about it. He was part of the founding group, but I think red was taken, green was taken, orange was taken.
Yellow is the extreme right wing in Israel. So yeah.
Yeah, it was purple.
Even gold was taken in Israeli politics. So yeah.
I think we made a good choice, no?
I love it. I love it.
I do quickly want to get to one question in the chat, because Sally, you did just mention Palestinian nationalism and kind of a resurgence and a pride in national identity for Palestinians, both Palestinian citizens of Israel and outside. Someone in the chat has asked, Peter Beinart has argued for one binational state and an end to the two-state solution. Has his idea gained any traction among Arab Israelis and or Palestinians?
Yes, of course, among many people. But the nature of the state of Israel or the states of Israel, Palestine is when you build a people's politics, it's not something that is relevant. In a sense that, yes, we work on political imagination. Yes, we want people to envision a better future. But the majority, when you talk to people here, let's say it like that, the people who have the privilege to talk about the big ideas of how exactly it would look like, are already convinced in many senses. Does that make sense? Going and trying to mobilize a poor Jewish young person from Petah Tikva who lives with a single mom about what the nature of the state of Israel would look like, or Israel-Palestine. You lost him. You lost him. And I think that's not a conversation that we really have in that sense. And we also don't talk about democracy for that exact reason, which is, I think, the comment of Alon-Lee. What is democracy for poor people? What is democracy, even for the occupied Palestinian person, in a refugee camp? What is democracy for him? What does that mean, right? We really need to start talking about things that are salient to people's lives in order to actually build politics that can create solutions. But we can't just talk about the solutions in abstract. But yes, I mean, if we are in a place we are privileged enough, yes, there are people who think about binational state. I think it is something that has becoming more of a conversation of ending the occupation is definitely a necessary step, which means an independence to the Palestinian state. But would that actually create just peace? Would that actually resolve the problems? Probably not. But yeah, it's an interesting conversation.
I'm really curious if there's people I know, and Shira, I appreciate you being on camera the whole time, but if there are any questions that people want to ask, because I think this is, for me, it's riveting in the sense that this is really a movement which stands so much in contrast to the things that most people learn and read about, depending upon what you read. But yeah, I have lots more questions, but I really like to give people an opportunity here to ask anything. Please don't be shy. You don't usually get Alon-Lee and Sally as a captive audience like this, so it's a real treat for us. I'm trying to unmute you. Hang on. Maytal, can you unmute Shira?
Worked for a second there.
Mm-hmm. Here we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. I really just want to say thank you, because that's exactly what it is, that I walked the walk and talked the talk for many decades living in Israel, and I'm currently displaced, for lack of a better word, and living in the States. But it's really encouraging to hear the both of you. This was wonderful. It's too bad that people are so burnt out on Zoom that there aren't more participants. I sense that everybody's just had enough of looking at computer boxes. But honestly, thank you so much, the both of you. It's really encouraging to believe it isn't just let's just give up. So much appreciated. No actual questions. And yeah, purple looks good to me.
Thank you. We also think so. And we'll be very happy to come and visit Canada one day. So yeah.
Well, I'm currently in Arizona, so the fight is more about, don't ask. It's grandchildren, that's all. There's only one reason.
It seems a very beautiful state. So also Arizona can be in the list.
I do want to say something about the purple. We are noticing a Meta brand being created in Israel around purple. During May, for example, I don't know if you've seen us on Twitter. We have like the purple dots on Twitter. So that like took over for a while. The municipality of Tel Aviv, actually, during May, they printed anti-violence, Arab-Jewish partnership signs, and they, distributed it all around Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and they were purple, our purple, actually. And today, you see so much, like in the Negev, they had like this run in the Bedouin communities around remembering one of the community members that was killed by a police force, and it was purple. Today, there was a beautiful, beautiful campaign that has been launched from an LGBTQ plus organization for Arab Palestinians in Israel. It was one of the very few and first, very bold, very, public LGBTQ plus advocacy in Arabic. And it was in purple. All I'm trying to say is that I think, and I don't know, maybe it's just us because we're like seeing purple everywhere. But I think in such a difficult realities, it's nice to have like that one made a thing and seeing it everywhere, even if they didn't think about it, seeing, at least trying to imagine a day where we are all a big network, a big ecosystem that can actually grow stronger. And it happens to be purple. It's yeah.
I know it's late already, but I will say that also in other countries in the world, purple is the color of the new kind of political left that is not part of the traditional communist or socialist party, the red parties, and it's not also an entirely or solely environmentalist green party. Look at Podemos in Spain, it's purple. Syriza in Greece, it's purple. Razem in Poland, purple. So those movements are purple movements, and also purple is the color of the feminist movement. So yeah,
it's a very regal color, and in Hebrew, sagul, right? And sagol has its own meaning. Have we got a couple minutes, Migtal? Can I just, I wanted to know about, I'd asked about whether people can visit you in Israel, meaning if there's any projects or things or some sort of siurim trips. And the other thing was just in terms of, because when you're building a movement, you get stretched, and obviously, resources are not just human resources, they're also financial resources. But what kind of alliances have you been building with international groups? I mean, I know you were in the States, not in Canada. I think that there would be interest amongst some of the groups that we're familiar with here, but have you reached out? Have people reached out to you? What kind of networks have been developing on that front?
There are many different areas, right? We are trying to build also ties with organizers, right? Just different organizations that do organizing and how we can do mutual learning. We are trying to build ties with public, with elected, leaders, and try to impact the conversation there. And we are also obviously one of the main things that we come to, and that is never talked about, is our support, our financial support, our donor support. So these are the three different areas that we are trying to develop in abroad, and I think you know, I kind of now understand why so many organizations, you know, give up on, you know, it's very hard to maintain balance between understanding that we are always directed to the public and to the Israeli public. That's our theory of change. But also we're very tempted to, you know, organize and mobilize in your communities, because we also see how much it can have an impact. But we are trying to balance between that, because we also understand that that's probably not our job. With that being said, we are extremely grateful for platforms like this to be able to talk about the work in that sense. And as of ties, you know, yeah, it's just things that are forever developing, but also very pre-elementary, very basic at the moment, I'm afraid.
So we're just past the hour here. If folks haven't taken a look in the chat, I've put in a few links there. You can donate. There's a link to donate. Please donate if you can. You can learn more about their work from their website. You can also follow along on social media. I've also put a link to the podcast Groundwork, which is co-hosted by Sally, that I believe there's a new season coming.
Yeah, it's in the works.
Amazing. And that is about activists working in the mixed cities in Israel. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate you being here. We really appreciate all the work that you're doing, and we support it from afar and hope to visit you a little bit closer soon. Thank you so much for being here. David, do you have any final goodbyes?
I just would like to wish both of you and all of your membership a lot of strength and continued belief in the justice of your work. And it really, my whole body is tingling because I recognize and have experienced what you're doing, and really what motivated Maytal and myself when we created this series was to take an activist and organizing direction, and you really manifest that for us. So I hope that we can find ways to have people to meet you and to get inspired by the work that you're doing. And at the same time, I recognize that it's hard work every day. And we just want to send you a lot of love and support and appreciation for what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend, for those of you for whom it's still a weekend.
And do subscribe to our newsletter. We really want to reach out to you in a click of a newsletter. That would really, you know, help us as well. You know, let you know what we need and how you can support us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good
Have a good
day.
one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.